June 6, 1944, a date the world will never forget. The night when courage and chaos collided, and the fate of humanity rested on the edge of a single decision. They called it Operation Overlord, but to those who lived it, it was more than just a military plan. It was the moment the free world rolled the dice on survival. For 5 long years, Europe had been crushed under the iron boot of Nazi rule. Country after country had fallen, cities burned, and millions of lives were lost to tyranny. The Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable. But across the Channel, in the quiet towns of southern England, a storm was gathering, a storm that would decide the future of the world. For months, the Allied forces had been preparing for something no one had ever attempted before. The largest amphibious invasion in human history. Over 156,000 men, more than 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, every weapon, every soldier, every ounce of courage pointed toward one single goal: to take back Europe from Hitler's grip. Hidden in the shadows, commanders knew this was the one chance to break the German fortress. The beaches of Normandy had been chosen as the landing site. A place both strategic and deadly. They called it a gamble with history itself. Every movement, every supply line, every coded message had to be perfect. If the Germans discovered the plan, if the weather turned against them, if even one piece of the operation failed, it could mean total disaster. The invasion would have to be called off, and the war could be lost. For months, deception was their weapon. Fake armies were built out of inflatable tanks. Radio chatter was staged to trick the Nazis into believing the attack would come from Calais, not Normandy. Even the weather reports were top secret, because one storm, one wave, one gust of wind could destroy everything before it began. And then came the moment of truth. June 5th was supposed to be the day of the invasion, but violent storms swept across the English Channel. Waves crashed against the ships, visibility dropped to nothing, and the sea turned into chaos. General Eisenhower faced an impossible choice: delay again, or risk everything. Around midnight, he gathered his commanders in a small room, the air heavy with tension. Meteorologists said there might be a tiny break in the weather, a small window of calm. Eisenhower looked at his men. Faces pale, eyes tired, every one of them knowing the weight of what this decision meant. Then he said the words that changed history. "Okay, let's go." 3 words that sent 156,000 men toward destiny. Across England, soldiers were already boarding landing craft, loading weapons, writing letters home. Letters they knew might be their last. The sky was filled with the roar of engines as thousands of planes prepared to cross the Channel. Some soldiers stared silently at the waves. Others prayed. Some smiled, pretending they weren't scared. But everyone knew the truth. Not all of them would make it back. The operation was so massive, so dangerous, that even the smallest mistake could cost tens of thousands of lives. Yet no one hesitated, because they knew what was at stake. Freedom, humanity, the right to live without fear. They weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting for the soul of the world. As night fell, the invasion began in silence. Thousands of paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines under the cover of darkness. The sea below them was black, the air cold and unforgiving. Planes roared through the clouds, anti-aircraft fire lighting up the sky like lightning. Many paratroopers never made it to the ground. Some were shot out of the sky, others drowned in flooded fields. But those who survived landed scattered across the countryside, miles from where they were supposed to be. Still, they carried out their missions. Cutting communications, blowing up bridges, and creating chaos among German forces. While they fought in the dark, the main invasion fleet was already moving across the Channel. Imagine the sight: 5,000 ships stretching from horizon to horizon, an armada so vast it seemed endless. battleships, destroyers, troop carriers, supply vessels. A moving city of war. The sea was alive with motion, the air thick with tension. Every man on those ships knew he was part of something bigger than himself. As the hours passed, the faint outline of the French coast began to appear through the fog. The beaches of Normandy, quiet for now, but soon to become the most violent place on earth. The soldiers checked their rifles, adjusted their helmets, tightened their gear. The smell of salt and diesel filled the air. The waves crashed against the sides of the landing craft as they waited for the signal. In those final moments, time seemed to stop. Some men whispered to God. Others clutched photos of their families. A few just stared straight ahead numb, trying to silence the fear inside their chest. And then came the signal. The engines roared to life, and the invasion of Europe began. It was 6:30 a.m., June 6, 1944, D-Day. The impossible mission had begun. No one knew if they would live to see the next sunrise. But they went anyway. Because they believed in something greater than fear. They believed that tyranny could be defeated, that light could rise again from darkness, and that freedom, no matter the cost, was worth dying for. The night before D-Day, when the world still slept under the shadow of war, the first phase of Operation Overlord began, and it started not with a roar, but with the whisper of engines cutting through the darkness. The paratroopers were the first to move, the men chosen to jump into hell before the sun even touched the horizon. They were the ghosts of the invasion, silent and unseen, sent behind enemy lines to prepare the way for the storm that would follow. Over 13,000 paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, and thousands more from the British 6th Airborne, were crammed into roaring C-47 aircraft. They sat in silence, their faces smeared with black paint, their hearts pounding as they looked out into the dark void beyond the open doors. Every man knew the risks. Many would not live to see the dawn. They weren't landing on a friendly beach. They were dropping into the heart of Nazi-occupied France, surrounded by enemy soldiers, anti-aircraft guns, and minefields. The mission was simple in words, but nearly impossible in execution. Secure the bridges, cut off reinforcements, destroy key German positions, and hold the ground until the main force arrived. If they failed, the landings on the beaches could turn into a massacre. At exactly 15 hours, the first planes crossed the coast of Normandy. The sky exploded with tracers and flak as the Germans opened fire. Red and green bullets tore through the night like fiery rain. Planes shook violently, engines screamed, and men held on to their gear, praying the next shell wouldn't find them. The pilots tried to hold steady, but the chaos of the storm and enemy fire scattered the formation. Many paratroopers were dropped miles off course. Some landed in flooded marshes and drowned under the weight of their gear. Others found themselves in open fields, surrounded by enemy troops. The landing was chaos, broken, disoriented, terrifying. But somehow, out of that chaos, heroism was born. In the dark fields of Normandy, small groups of soldiers regrouped, using only their courage and instinct. They carried little more than rifles, knives, and the will to fight. They blew up bridges to block German tanks, captured crossroads to delay reinforcements, and ambushed enemy patrols, who never saw them coming. In the black of night, the German army had no idea what was happening. Gunfire echoed from every direction, flares lit up the sky, and explosions shattered the silence of the countryside. It felt like the invasion was everywhere at once. And that confusion was exactly what the Allies needed. In the chaos, a young paratrooper named John Steele became one of the most iconic figures of that night. As his unit jumped near the town of Saint-Aimé-Rieglis, heavy anti-aircraft fire caught their planes. Steele's parachute snagged on the church steeple, leaving him hanging helplessly as the battle raged below. He hung there for hours, pretending to be dead as bullets and flames filled the square beneath him. Somehow, he survived. That small town would later become one of the first liberated in France, and Steele would live to tell the story that still sends chills down the spine of anyone who hears it. Across the countryside, similar acts of courage unfolded in the shadows. Lieutenant Dick Winters and his men from Easy Company dropped miles from their objective, but regrouped quickly, attacking a German artillery position at Braray-Court-Maina. Outnumbered and under fire, they silenced 4 deadly guns that were pounding Utah Beach. That action alone saved countless lives during the beach landings. Elsewhere, British paratroopers carried out one of the most daring missions of the war: to seize Pegasus Bridge. Their gliders crash, landed within meters of their target, throwing men violently from their seats. Dazed and injured, they still stormed the bridge and captured it within minutes, cutting off the Germans from sending reinforcements to the beaches. For hours that night, Normandy became a battlefield of shadows. Men who had never met before fought side by side, guided only by the flicker of muzzle flashes and the echo of commands shouted through the dark. They fought through villages, orchards, and hedgerows, not knowing where they were, but knowing exactly what they were fighting for. Some units found themselves completely alone, surrounded by enemy soldiers. Instead of retreating, they dug in, held their ground, and fought with everything they had until dawn. Communication was nearly impossible. Radios were lost or broken, maps were useless, and yet somehow the paratroopers kept pushing forward. The Germans, confused by the scale and precision of the attacks, believed they were facing a much larger force than they actually were. That confusion bought precious time for the invasion fleet approaching the beaches. Every bridge destroyed, every road blocked, every German patrol ambushed meant one less threat waiting for the soldiers about to land at dawn. These men were the unseen heroes of D-Day, their courage paving the way for victory before the world even knew the invasion had begun. As the hours crept toward morning, the sky slowly began to lighten with the first pale glow of dawn. Smoke drifted across the fields, the smell of gunpowder and burning metal filling the air. Bodies lay scattered across the countryside. Friends, enemies, brothers in arms. The cost was high, the losses heavy, but the mission was succeeding. Key bridges had been secured, major roads were cut off, and the German response was in disarray. Behind enemy lines, these paratroopers had turned the night into a weapon. They fought with no reinforcements, no tanks, no heavy artillery, just grit, skill, and an unbreakable spirit. For them, there was no turning back, no safe retreat, only forward. Each small victory in those hours was a piece of the larger miracle that would unfold at sunrise. When the first waves of soldiers hit the beaches, they did so because the ghosts of the night had done their job. They had risked everything so that others could follow. In those dark hours before dawn, when the rest of the world slept, the fate of freedom hung in the balance. And it was the paratroopers who carried it on their shoulders. They were the first to fight, the first to bleed, and the first to prove that even in the darkest night, courage burns brighter than fear. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon on June 6, 1944, the English Channel was alive with movement, a living storm of metal and men. The sea itself trembling beneath, the weight of history about to be written, and ahead of that endless armada lay the coast of Normandy, calm, silent, and waiting. But within minutes, it would become the most violent place on earth. The soldiers on those landing crafts could see nothing but grey waves and a distant strip of land shrouded in mist, Yet every man knew what was waiting for them beyond that horizon: machine guns, mines, artillery, and death. They could hear the thunder of the battleships behind them, firing their massive guns toward the shore, each explosion shaking the sea, lighting up the sky like lightning striking the earth. The smell of salt, oil, and smoke filled their lungs, and the air was thick with tension so heavy it could crush a man's soul. Inside the landing craft, soldiers gripped their rifles so tight their knuckles turned white, their faces pale, their hearts racing faster than the engines that carried them. Some whispered prayers, some cursed under their breath, and some just stared at the floor, lost in the silence of fear. The ramp would drop soon, and they all knew what that meant. For some, it would be the last thing they ever saw. The Germans had spent years turning the Normandy coast into a fortress. Bunkers of steel and concrete lined the cliffs, machine guns, positioned to sweep the beaches from end to end, mortars hidden in the hills, mines buried under the sand, and barbed wire tangled like a deadly web, waiting to trap anyone who dared to land. As the first wave approached, the calm of dawn shattered. The sky erupted with gunfire, artillery shells howling overhead, before crashing into the sea, sending geysers of water and steel into the air. Machine guns opened up from the cliffs, the sound a relentless scream of death that tore through the morning air. The first landing crafts were hit before they even reached the beach. Explosions ripping through their hulls, bodies thrown into the waves, the sea turning red with blood. Still, the others pressed forward, driven by duty, by fear, by the thought of the men beside them. When the ramps finally dropped, chaos exploded. Soldiers leapt into waste, deep water under a storm of bullets. Some instantly cut down, others pulled under by the weight of their gear. The waves carried their bodies back and forth, but the living pushed forward, crawling, swimming, dragging themselves through the surf toward a beach that looked more like the mouth of hell. Omaha Beach was the worst of them all. The Americans who landed there faced cliffs that spat fire and sand that swallowed blood. The tide ran red before the first hour was over. There was nowhere to hide, no cover, just bullets slicing through the air like invisible blades. Men used the bodies of their fallen brothers as shields, crawling inch by inch, desperate to survive, desperate to move forward even a few feet. Commanders were dead, radios were gone, and chaos ruled the shore. Yet through that chaos, small groups began to form, soldiers shouting through the roar of battle, gathering whoever was still alive, pushing forward through the carnage. They used whatever they could find, craters, obstacles, even smoke from burning landing craft, to inch closer to the cliffs. Engineers rushed through gunfire to clear mines and barbed wire, cutting paths through death itself. On Utah Beach, the landing went wrong from the start. The current had pushed the first wave nearly 2,000 yards off course. But the commander, General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., looked at the map, looked at his men, and simply said, "We'll start the war from right here." Those words became legend, and Utah Beach, against all odds, turned into one of the most successful landings of the day. On the British and Canadian beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the story was no less brutal. Machine gun fire raked the sand, mortars burst among the waves, and entire squads vanished in seconds. But the discipline and determination of those soldiers turned chaos into progress. They fought street by street, bunker by bunker, until the beaches were theirs. At Juno Beach, Canadian troops faced fierce resistance and lost hundreds in the first few minutes, but by noon, they had pushed farther inland than any other Allied force. It was courage that no history book could ever fully describe. The kind of courage that came from men who knew they might not live another hour. but still refused to stop. Back at Omaha, the slaughter continued. Bodies littered the shore, smoke covered the sky, and the cries of the wounded mixed with the thunder of explosions. The tide kept rising, threatening to drown the injured who couldn't move. The living had to make an impossible choice: try to save their brothers or push forward and finish the mission. Many did both, carrying the wounded on their backs through bullets and fire, refusing to let them die alone. Slowly, painfully, the balance began to shift. The naval bombardment found its mark, silencing some of the German guns. Engineers cleared more obstacles. Small groups of men reached the base of the cliffs, where they began to climb, using ropes, bayonets, even their bare hands. Above them, the Germans fired down, desperate to hold the line, but the Allies were relentless. By midday, they had broken through. Omaha Beach, the graveyard of the morning, began to turn into a foothold for victory. Smoke, fire, and blood painted the scene, but through it all, the Allied flag began to rise above the chaos. By evening, the beaches that had looked impossible to take were filled with thousands of men, tanks, and supplies pouring onto French soil. The cost was beyond comprehension. Over 4,000 Allied soldiers lay dead. Thousands more wounded or missing. But they had done what many believed could never be done. They had breached Hitler's fortress Europe. The beaches were theirs. The impossible had become reality, paid for in blood and bravery. Those few miles of sand, soaked in sacrifice, became the doorway through which freedom would march across Europe. When the smoke began to clear over the beaches of Normandy, the scale of what had happened started to sink in. But no one on that blood-stained sand had time to think about glory, because what surrounded them was not triumph. It was the brutal price of freedom, a cost so high that even victory felt hollow. And yet that price was willingly paid by men who had already accepted death before they even stepped off the landing craft. The sea was still red. Bodies floated among the wreckage of boats torn apart by shells. Helmets drifted like empty memories on the tide, and the cries of the wounded echoed through the chaos, a haunting symphony of courage and pain. Medics ran through gunfire, dragging the living from the water, bandaging wounds with shaking hands, whispering words of comfort that were swallowed by the sound of distant explosions. Every inch of that beach was a story, every fallen soldier a chapter of sacrifice written in blood. Some lay still, their faces calm, as if asleep. Others reached out for comrades who were no longer there. The air was thick with smoke, and the heavy smell of iron and salt, the stench of war hanging over everything. Soldiers who survived the first wave staggered inland, eyes blank, uniforms shredded, too exhausted to speak, but their mission wasn't over. The battle for Normandy had only begun, and what waited beyond the beaches was even more brutal. The fields of France were a maze of hedgerows, stone walls, and hidden machine guns. Every step forward meant another fight, another ambush, another friend lost. The Germans counterattacked fiercely, determined to throw the Allies back into the sea, and the men who had survived day now faced days and nights of relentless combat. The cost grew heavier with every mile. Tanks burned in the fields, villages were reduced to rubble, and the dead lay in rows waiting to be buried. Yet the soldiers kept going, not because they were fearless, but because stopping wasn't an option. They had seen what failure looked like, and it wore the face of tyranny. They knew that every life lost here would mean millions saved later. That belief was the only thing holding them together as rain turned the soil into mud and blood, mixed with the earth beneath their boots. Letters were found in the pockets of the dead. Messages to wives, mothers, and children that would never be sent, words written in hope, carried across the sea now stained with the dirt of Normandy. One wrote, "If you read this, it means I didn't make it. But I'd do it all again, because I believe the world needs to be free." Those words, simple and raw, said more than any speech ever could. Freedom had never been free, and that morning it was paid for in full by the bravest generation to ever walk the earth. As supplies poured in and reinforcements landed, commanders looked at the casualty lists in disbelief. More than 4,000 Allied soldiers had been killed on D-Day alone, tens of thousands more wounded or missing, their bodies scattered from the waterline to the fields beyond. Each number on that list represented a heartbeat, a life, a story that ended on foreign soil. Chaplains moved quietly among the survivors, offering prayers over makeshift graves, their voices trembling as they tried to find words big enough to honor what they were witnessing. There were no heroes in that moment, only brothers, alive and dead, bound by something deeper than duty. They had seen what the world looked like under the weight of evil, and they had decided to stop it, no matter the cost. The liberation of Europe would not be quick or easy. The fight through Normandy was a nightmare of smoke, fire, and loss. Entire towns were flattened, civilians caught in the crossfire. The price of freedom paid not just by soldiers, but by ordinary people who had lived under occupation for years. Yet through the destruction, hope began to flicker. French villagers emerged from hiding, offering bread, water, and tears to the men in dusty uniforms who spoke of liberty. The soldiers, filthy and broken, smiled through exhaustion because, for the first time, they could see what their sacrifice meant. Every mile they gained was one less under Nazi control. Every victory, no matter how small, was a step toward ending a war that had consumed the world. Still, the toll was staggering. Graves were dug everywhere. White crosses and stars of David lined up in endless rows across the green fields of Normandy, silent witnesses to the price that was paid. Those who survived carried scars that no medal could erase. Scars on their bodies, scars in their minds. Memories that would follow them long after the shooting stopped. They had seen friends blown apart, seen the sea turn red, seen what humanity was capable of when hatred ruled unchecked. And yet, despite it all, they had kept going, because surrender was never an option. The cost of freedom was written not only in the dead, but in the living who carried on, in every man who picked up the rifle of a fallen comrade and kept fighting, in every medic who refused to leave a wounded soldier behind, in every moment of courage that defied logic and fear. The war was far from over, but D-Day had changed everything. It proved that even against impossible odds, unity could conquer evil, that light could rise again out of the darkest night. As the sun set over Normandy that evening, the beaches were quiet again, waves washing gently over the sand that only hours before had been alive with gunfire and screams. The survivors sat in silence, staring out at the horizon, trying to understand what they had just lived through. Some cried, some prayed, and some just sat still, the weight of loss pressing on their hearts. They knew the cost. They had seen it, felt it, lived it. And though victory was still far away, they had taken the first step, not just toward liberating Europe, but toward reminding the world what freedom truly means. It means sacrifice. It means pain. It means standing up when everything tells you to fall. And those who paid that price on the beaches and fields of Normandy carried the burden of that truth, so the rest of the world could stand free. When the sun rose over the beaches of Normandy on June 7th, 1944, it did not shine on victory alone. It shone on the faces of men who had fought through hell and somehow lived to see another day. It shone on the wreckage of war, on twisted steel, broken weapons, and bodies that told the story of what freedom truly costs. But beyond the destruction, beyond the blood and the smoke, it also shone on hope, because for the first time in years, the free world had struck back with everything it had, and the tide of history had begun to turn. Operation Overlord was more than just an invasion. It was the moment the world decided it would no longer bow to fear, no longer kneel to tyranny, no longer accept the chains that had bound millions under Nazi rule. The Allies had landed, they had fought, and now they would not stop until every inch of Europe was free. The German army, stunned by the scale of the assault, tried to recover, but it was already too late. The beachhead had been secured, the machine of liberation had begun to roll forward. Every soldier who stepped off those beaches carried not just a rifle, but the weight of a world desperate for deliverance. The world had watched Germany march across nations, had watched cities burn, families torn apart, and hope nearly vanish. But now the world was watching something else. It was watching the return of courage, unity, and defiance. The day the world fought back wasn't just a battle, it was a rebirth. Across the fields of Normandy, through villages reduced to rubble, through hedgerows and farmlands soaked in rain and blood, the Allied armies pushed forward with unrelenting force. Each mile gained was paid for in lives, but with every step, the iron grip of Nazi power began to break. Farmers peeked from shattered doorways to see men in strange uniforms carrying flags they hadn't seen in years. The stars and stripes, the Union Jack, the maple leaf, symbols of nations that had come together to end darkness itself. The people of France, who had lived under occupation for 4 long years, could hardly believe what they were seeing. Children ran into the streets crying. Women wept as they handed bread and wine to soldiers covered in mud, their eyes wide with disbelief and gratitude. For them, these men weren't just soldiers. They were angels from across the sea, the answer to prayers whispered in basements and fields every night of the occupation. But liberation wasn't free. Every step toward Paris was another battle, every bridge defended, every town fortified. The Germans fought with desperation, knowing what defeat meant, and the Allies fought with fury, knowing what victory would bring. Bombers roared overhead. Tanks rumbled through narrow roads, and the sound of gunfire became the rhythm of freedom, clawing its way back into the world. Commanders wrote reports filled with numbers, but the numbers couldn't tell the truth of what those men endured. They couldn't describe the exhaustion in the eyes of a soldier who hadn't slept in 3 days, or the silence after a firefight when the only sound left was the wind moving through the trees. The day the world fought back wasn't about statistics. It was about spirit. The kind of spirit that makes a man stand up when everything around him is telling him to stay down. It was about those who saw death and still moved forward because they believed something greater was waiting on the other side. Of fear. By the time the Allies began pushing out of Normandy, the tide of war had turned completely. Hitler's dream of domination was crumbling, and the walls of his so-called fortress were cracking from within. The Soviets were advancing from the east, the Allies from the west, and the noose around Nazi Germany was tightening. But make no mistake, the turning point was D-Day. It was that moment, that impossible act of unity and courage, that reignited the world's belief that evil could be defeated. And it wasn't just the soldiers who fought back. It was the civilians who hid resistance fighters. The engineers who built the ships and planes, the nurses who worked through the night, trying to save lives with trembling hands, the families who rationed food and fuel so the troops could have more. The world fought back together. It was humanity standing shoulder to shoulder, saying no more. In the ruins of war, something extraordinary began to happen. nations that had been broken began to heal. Countries once divided by fear stood united under a single cause: freedom. When the Allied armies finally broke through Normandy and began the march toward Paris, it wasn't just a military movement. It was history correcting itself, the light returning after years of darkness. The liberation of France became the symbol of a world that had refused to give up, a world that had looked death in the face and chosen defiance instead. The men who fought there didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as doing what needed to be done, but history would remember them differently. History would remember them as the generation that saved the world. And when Paris was finally freed in August 1944, the bells that had been silent for years rang again, echoing across the rooftops, announcing to the world that freedom had returned. Crowds filled the streets, cheering, crying, embracing the soldiers who had fought their way across France. The photographs taken that day captured more than joy. They captured the rebirth of hope, the moment humanity reclaimed its soul. The war would rage on for nearly another year, but from that day forward, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Day had unleashed a force that could not be stopped, not by fear, not by bombs, not by any army on earth. The day the world fought back was not a single battle or a single victory. It was the awakening of everything good in mankind, the reminder that even in the darkest times, there will always be those who rise. Those beaches, those fields, those men, they changed the course of history. And though the world moved on, though decades have passed, the legacy remains in every freedom we enjoy today. The day the world fought back was not just about defeating an enemy. It was about proving that humanity, when united, can overcome even the most powerful evil.